think every speaker has said his title and then asked, is this the most important thing? This is one of those times when I can actually take you to a text where someone essentially asked Jesus, what is the most important command? And Jesus answered the question. I'd like to invite your attention to Matthew chapter 22 as we begin this evening or this afternoon. Matthew chapter 22. And notice that in verse 34, the Pharisees had heard that Jesus had put the Sadducees to silence and they were gathered together. And then one of them, who was a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him or tempting him and saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Now, there were said to have been 613 commands in the law of Moses, and it's as if he's asking Jesus, which one of these is the most important command? Which one ranks above all the others? Now, I find it fascinating that Jesus didn't say there's no command that ranks above another. They're all equally on the same plane because they came from the same divine power and authority, and thus they're all equally binding. Though that's true, Jesus did say that one command is more important than any of the others, and I want to show you why he said that. He said in his answer in verse 37, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. If you'll go back to the book of Deuteronomy, I want to show you 3 places in the book of Deuteronomy where this emphasis is given. I think sometimes we may be under the mistaken impression that Jesus was the first one to ever use the phraseology with all your heart and with all your soul. But if you'll go to Deuteronomy and start in chapter 6, you'll notice there in chapter 6 and verse number 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. Now, it would be significant if that were stated only once, but look at Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse number 12. In Deuteronomy 10 and verse 12, Now Israel, what does the Lord thy God require of thee but to fear the Lord thy God and to walk in all his ways? Did you notice Brother Taylor's excellent sermon this morning centered on fear God and keep his commandments? What have we just heard? Fear the Lord thy God and walk in all his ways. That's the same as saying fear God and keep his commandments. What would make me want to? And to love him and to serve the Lord thy God, here it is, with all thy heart and with all thy soul, to keep the commandments, plural, of the Lord, and his statutes, plural, which I command thee this day for thy good. If you'll love God as you ought to love him and obey that command, you'll obey the commands, plural. You'll do all that God has asked you to do. And then look at Deuteronomy chapter 30 for just a moment. Deuteronomy chapter 30. And notice the statement that is made in verse number 2. He says, there's going to come a time when you'll be driven into foreign lands, and then you'll return to the Lord thy God, Deuteronomy 30 and verse 2, and you'll obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day, thou and thy children, with all thine heart and with all thy soul. And zoom in on verse 6, and the Lord thy God shall circumcise thine heart and the heart of thy seed to do what? Love the Lord thy God, how much? With all thine heart and with all thy soul. Is that a big deal? That thou mayest live. It's a matter of life and death, spiritually speaking. So when this man comes to Jesus and says, what's the greatest, the most important command of all commands? Jesus identifies the one that Deuteronomy has already given and says it is to love the Lord thy God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your might, your strength, with every fiber of your being. He says, this is the first and great commandment. Is it the most important thing? Jesus says it is. And notice in verse number 39. Now, he didn't ask about what's the second ranked commandment of all commandments, but Jesus goes ahead and throws it in. The second is like the first. He says, what's the common element between the second commandment and the first commandment? In the first commandment, it is to love God with all of your heart, soul, strength, and mind. The second commandment, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There is love in the top two commandments that are given. In fact, Jesus says, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And if you take the schedule for this lectureship, and it's just coincidental, it doesn't have anything to do with my preaching on this particular subject, but it's just the case. If you take the schedule for this lectureship and look at all of the other topics, is it true or false that love would be the motivating factor in all of the good ones, and love would be that which would guide us away from the bad ones? Love of money, it's the root of all evil. But if you love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, you're not going to love money first, because your whole fiber and being has been put into loving God. And so it all starts with love. I want to take the second commandment, backtrack to the first, and then show you how important these two are to your daily life and to mine. Go to Romans 13, if you will, please. Romans chapter 13, and notice the statement that is made in verse number 8 regarding the second commandment, to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Notice, owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery. There's one of the commandments. Thou shalt not kill. That's one of the 10 commandments under which people lived in the Old Testament times. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet. It just so happens that all of the ones mentioned in verse 9 were also applicable to New Testament Christians. There's no remember the Sabbath day emphasis in verse 9. The commandments given in verse 9 are applicable to both the Old and New Testament people. And you'll notice, if there be any other commandment, don't care what commandment it is, you can briefly comprehend it in this saying, namely what? Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Meaning, if I can get a man to love his neighbor as he ought to love him, he won't steal from his tool shed when he's not looking. He won't try to steal his wife from him. He will not participate in acts that would damage his neighbor. If he loves him as he ought to love him, if he loves him as he loves himself, then verse 10 of Romans 13, love will work no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love's the fulfilling of the law. So you show me a man that loves his neighbor as he ought to love him, and I'll show you a man that will treat his neighbor exactly as the rest of the scriptures tell him he ought to treat his neighbor. Now let's go back now to the idea of loving God with all of your heart, your soul, your strength, your mind. How will that manifest itself? Let me ask you a question. Is church attendance one of the most important things in the Christian life? Yes or no? Is church attendance one of the most important things in the Christian life? Well, sure. It's so energizing to be together, isn't it? Haven't you been built up by just being with the brethren here every year for 40 years? Some of you have been here for so many of those lectureships. It's been my privilege and my family's privilege to be here for the last few. I can't remember exactly how many, but I know we always leave, even though we're weary in the flesh sometimes, we leave charged up spiritually. Why? Did you hear about the preacher that went to visit someone that had not been attending services? And he was trying to make a point, and there was a fire burning there on the hearth. And the preacher just went over silently and took the tongs and extracted one of the burning coals from that fire and then set it off on the ledge of the hearth by itself. And you know what happened. It started to cool, and pretty soon it got to the point where He could pick it up without the tongue. He could just actually pick it up in his hand without any fear of being burned. And he tried to make the point to the man, when you separate yourself from the assembly, you begin to have your faith grow cold. You start losing your fire, your fervor. I don't know how many times I've seen it in my preaching life. In fact, I remember one church where I preached, we had a member of the church that was so dedicated, you could count on him to be there every time the doors were open, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, vacation Bible school, gospel meeting, didn't matter. He was going to be there. Then he started building his own house. And then suddenly he starts missing some on Sunday nights. Then he's missing Wednesday nights. He's missing pretty much every service but Sunday morning only. Now, I'm happy to say that he has now been restored, but there was a period of years, actually, where he got so distracted by building his own house that he forgot about God's. And you remember the book of Haggai is basically warning them, look, you're so busy building your sealed houses, the house of God is not being advanced. You laid the foundation and you've done nothing else. You need to get busy and build the house of God. Well, the house of God today is the church, and we can build it up by our actions and activities. What would make me want to attend the worship services? It is the most important thing in the world, love. You show me a man that loves God with all of his heart, soul, strength, and mind. I'll show you a man that can't wait to go worship God. It's true. Not out of raw duty. Look, as a preacher, I've learned some things over the years. I keep learning some things. I think in my early preaching life, when I'd go visit a delinquent member, I might read Hebrews 10:25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is. I'd read Matthew 6:33, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. All these things shall be added unto you. I still read those verses, but I don't start there anymore. I want to ask you to go to 1 John chapter 4 with me for just a moment and notice a principle that is so key to developing proper love in the heart of the Christian. In 1 John chapter 4, the Bible says in verse 19, so simple a verse and yet so profound and powerful. We love him because why? He first loved us. Did you ever see that plaque that says, I asked the Lord, how much do you love me? And he stretched out his arms and said, this much. This idea of Jesus Christ loving you and me so much that he came to die for us. You know John 3:16. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that how did he manifest that love? He gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. What about 1 John 3:16? Did you notice 1 John 3:16 really coincides with John 3:16 in this concept? Hereby perceive we the love of God. How do we perceive it? Because he laid down his life for us. That's when you really know that, and yet will I give him my life? He gave me his. He bled and died for me. You know, when I was dating Tish before we got married, she lived in Marietta, Georgia, and I lived in, at that time, Etowah, Tennessee, 2.5 hours away. She worked during the week, and so did I. So Saturday was it. I was preaching on Sundays and I had other responsibilities. So Saturday was it. I'm not a night owl. I'm not a morning person. I'm a night owl. And I would get up at the crack of dawn on Saturday morning, get in my vehicle, drive 2.5 hours to Marietta, Georgia, and she'd be waiting for me out on the step of her house. We spent the day together. You know who twisted my arm and put me on a guilt trip to make me do that? Who? What seminar did I attend that made me feel like, yeah, I guess I do need to go see her on Saturdays? That guy had a good point. Who banged on my door Saturday morning and said, "Are you going to go see that girl like you ought to?" You know what drove me down there? You know, don't you? Is love. That's it. No one had to twist my arm and coerce me. And I dare say if at the end of the day I had looked over at her and said, "Okay, this has been great," and everything like that, but when do I have to do this again? I'll do it. I just want to know the minimum amount of times I can do it and still be in love with you. How many times do I have to go to church? Have you ever heard that question? What does that reflect? I never did say, how many times do I have to go see Tish? It was, how many times do I get to, right? And I want to be there to worship God. I want to serve Him Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, because those are precious opportunities. Love is going to lead to better church attendance. Show me a church that loves God, and I'll show you a church that will assemble to worship God. That's what we need. Did you hear about two preachers that were talking about their Wednesday night service, and one of them said, "Well, we actually have moved it to Thursday nights." Okay. Well, how do the members feel about that? He said, "Well, some of them don't know it yet." I stopped and think about that for a moment. There's some folks who wouldn't find out and I remember when I was preaching in one congregation, this one fellow that I went to school with in college just so happened to land in our area and started attending where I was preaching. He loved sports, and I did too. On Friday nights, we'd play basketball. We'd just get a group of us together, and we'd play basketball out of our own pockets. We'd rent a gym, and we just really enjoyed the recreation. Well, it was one of those deals where if you didn't show up, or if enough people didn't show up, then the ones who did had to pay the amount of the rental for the gym, and if you only had 3 or 4 guys show up, it cost more than if you had 20 show up. And one night he was just railing about how people made a commitment to this, and now they're backing out of their commitments, and he was going on and on. And then he said, "You know, while we have a minute here and we can talk, I have been a member of the church for 30 years almost now, 30 years almost." And he said, "I have never ever seen a church that I've attended teach any classes on the Song of Solomon. 30 years of my life. I think that's a mistake." And he went on and on. I let him go on and on. And then I paused. I said, "We just finished a 13-week study of Song of Solomon on Wednesday nights." "Oh, okay." He was playing racquetball. He wasn't at services. I'm telling you that when we love God with every ounce of strength we possess, we're going to want to worship. Here's next. Would you agree it's important that every member of the church read the Word of God? Would you think that's an important thing? Do you know what used to be said of people? The Church of Christ was known for its members knowing this book. They were a Bible-toting, Bible-quoting people. You've heard the stories about, well, that one courthouse couldn't find their copy of the Bible for someone to put their hand on and say, "I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." And someone suggested they just put their hand on the head of a Church of Christ member that happened to be in the courtroom. That'd be about the same thing, someone said. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you and I were known for this book, knowing this book so well? There's only one way to get to know this book, and that's to take time to study it and read it. Someone said, "I'd give half of my life to know the Bible as well as you do, preacher." And the preacher said, "Well, that's what it took me to get that much knowledge, and I'm still trying to get more. So it's going to cost you some time and some effort." But what would make you want to read this? Someone says, "I'll tell you what would make somebody want to read it. If you told them there are verses in the Bible that commanded them to read it, then they'd probably want to read." Okay, give attendance to reading, 1 Timothy 4:13. Study to show thyself approved of God, and that includes more than just reading a book and making, but it includes reading and knowing the book. If you can't, you've got to at least include that. So all these things, look, I don't need to read you the passages here that say you and I ought to read this book. We know it. The question is not what does the Bible command, it's why don't we do it more? And I'm telling you what the answer is. the most important thing in all the world, love, would make me read this book more. True? Are there any ladies in this room whose husbands fought overseas for our country and wrote you letters which you kept and which you tied a ribbon around and which we could go to your house right now and find? Why did you keep that correspondence? Tish would write me letters when we were not yet married, and I'd go to the mailbox, and imagine someone coming into my home and seeing those letters stacked up on my shelf unopened. What's all this? Oh, that's letters from the love of my life. But they don't appear to be opened. No, I've been very busy lately. I just haven't had time, but you can tell I value every one of those words because I have kept them. I plan someday when life slows down to read every one of those letters. How plausible does that sound to you? No. I opened it at the mailbox, I read it, then I took it back down to where I was living and kept it even though I'd already read it. I wanted to read it again someday. Why? This is communication to me from someone I love. The most important thing in the whole world will make me read the most important book in the whole world, and that is love. Now, we've been teasing about grandparents, and my wife and I are now in the grandparent club, so we can get in on this little fun. I love Brother Garland Elkins. I miss him so. I know you all do too. Brother Elkins used to tell about this grandparent that got on a plane where there was open seating. You could sit wherever you want if you got there first. And some were already seated, and this man's walking down the aisle. He says, "Excuse me, do you have grandchildren?" "Yes, sir." No, he keeps going. "I don't want to sit by them." "Do you have grandchildren?" "Yes, sir." "I don't want to sit by them." "What about you? Do you have any grandchildren?" "No, sir." "Perfect. I can sit down here and tell you about my grandchildren, and I won't have to be interrupted with boring stories about your grandchildren." That's the way that we feel when our grandchildren... Let me ask you a question. What seminar did you grandparents attend to say when you become a grandparent, you've got to talk about that grandson? You're required to talk about your grandchildren. You are obligated to... What seminar did you have to go to make you do it? You know the answer. There's not a grandparent that's been talking this week who did anything they did talking about their grandchildren out of just sheer duty and obligation. It's love. I want to talk about the ones. You ever see a girl that just got engaged between services Sunday and Wednesday night? Does she come in Wednesday night covering her hand open? No one sees. She's in your face. Look, 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 look. Do you see what happened? I got engaged. I'm in love. I'm in love. Love, the most important thing. And I tell you, if I love God with every fiber of my being, I'm going to talk about Him more. And then there is this matter of giving. What would make me want to give to God is I ought to give to God. It's the same thing. It's love. What is love all about? It's about God so loved that He gave. And what I give Him my... In fact, Jesus, we sometimes depict Him in that song as saying, "I gave my life for thee, my precious blood I shed, that thou mightst ransom be and quicken from the dead." I gave my life for thee. And then what's the next question? What hast thou given for me? What have you given for me? And I need to ask that. Have I given Him of my time to study His Word? Am I praying to Him? I know the Bible says continue in prayer. What would make me want to? I want to talk to someone that I love so much. And even though we sometimes are separated from our loved ones, we talk to them on the phone, we FaceTime, we look for ways to communicate because we love them and we can't wait to talk to them. So there is the business of church attendance, reading the Bible, giving as we've been prospered, praying fervently, evangelizing. Can I ask you a question? If this church or every church represented here had better church attendance, more Bible readers, more prayers being offered, and you say, well, that one's not all that big of a deal. I went to a church one time held a gospel meeting there a few years earlier. I came back, they tripled in size. I said, well, what? This is great. What happened? I said, well, the way it started was we started getting together on Sunday afternoons, purely voluntary basis. Anyone that wants to come 30 minutes early to pray specifically for the church to grow in these areas, then you can do that. And that turned into from once a month, it turned into, we had a handful of people that were coming 30 minutes before evening service praying specifically. And then once we started praying for works to be improved, we started putting legs on those prayers, and we got more involved, and this is the result. So show me a church that wants better church attendance, better Bible reading, more Bible readers, more evangelistic activity, more giving, more praying, and tell me whether that church is going to be better off than the church that doesn't have those things. Yes. But how do I get all those things? I love God, and so I want to be with Him. I love God, so I want to see what He said to me. I love God, so I want to talk to Him. I love God, so I want to talk about Him. I love God, so I want to give to Him. It all starts with love. It's the most important thing in the world. And it leads to a faith that works. It leads to so many of these other things. If I love God, then I will be more inclined to fear Him and keep His commandments. Because Jesus said what in John 14:15? If you love me, what? Keep my commandments. And what does 1 John 5:3 say? For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome. They seem light. And I'll close with this illustration. I remember some years ago going to a theme park when we had our child with us. It was slower going through the theme park than it used to be before we had children. And you know, our child at that time weighed about, I guess, 30 pounds, 25 to 30 pounds maybe, is my recollection. And I carried him around most of the day in that theme park, and I didn't mind it. If somebody had come up to me and said, hey, when you get to the theme park, we're going to hand you this 25-pound bag of potatoes. I want you to carry around with you all day. Now, if you mash them up and put some gravy on them, then maybe we've got a deal. But just to carry around a sack of potatoes that weighs 25 pounds, what a burden. How would you like to carry a 25-pound bag of potatoes through a theme park with you on every ride to every attraction, stand in line holding that 25-pound bag of potatoes the whole time? Would you want to do that? My child at times weighed more than that, and I still love it. It was what made the difference. I love this child. I love the relationship I have with this child. And yeah, there may be some sacrifices that I'm making, but they are well worth it because of the loving relationship we share. Ephesians 2 in verse 4 talks about His great love wherewith He loved us. Great love. God commendeth His love toward us, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, the ungodly. Romans 5:6-8. I'm so grateful for a God who loved me when I didn't deserve it, and I want to live for Him. That's the most important thing in the world to me, is to live for Him so that someday I get to live with Him. I wouldn't begin to question whether you love God or don't love Him. The truth is that our actions show whether we do. My mom always used to say, actions speak louder than words, son. And you say you love me, but you're not showing it very well right now because you're not doing what I ask you to do. She loved me, and I love her. God loved me. I love Him. I pray that we all will.